All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual event space. So my name is Allie. You might recognize me from our Lake Forest Park location. I'm your host for this evening, and I am so excited to have Dr. Clarence Lusane here with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz to discuss his book, $20 and Change. But before we get into the good stuff, on behalf of all of us here at Third Place Books, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. For those of you who may not know, we are an independent bookstore with 3 locations in the Seattle area. We're having more and more of these events in person, which is very exciting. But our online event program is sticking around to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in and buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. So, if you haven't gotten your hands on copies of any of the books that come up this evening and you would like to, I will be linking books in the chat. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in and grab a copy off the shelf, or you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local, we of course do ship. So go ahead and follow those links in chat over to our website. While you're on the website, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up in the new year. So if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our book clubs, and of course, follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. Okay, so tonight we are here for about an hour, and towards the end, we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, we love your questions, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be either at the top or bottom of your screen. It is different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. I absolutely invite you to share where you're tuning in from in the chat right now. We love to hear from you. But when it comes time for questions, do make sure those end up in the Q&A so that we can most easily find them. While you're in our chat and question spaces, I do want to remind you to please lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. And finally, should any technical issues arise, we will work as quickly as we can to resolve them, and we appreciate very much your patience and understanding. All right. So now is the time for us all to settle in and get comfortable, because without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome author, activist, scholar, and journalist Dr. Clarence Lusane. He's written many books, including The Black History of the White House, Hitler's Black Victims, Race in the Global Era, and Pipe Dream Blues. He is a professor and former chairman of Howard University's Department of Political Science, has been a political consultant at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and a former commissioner for the DC Commission on African American Affairs. He has spoken and taught all over the world, including at the White House at the Obama's invitation, and frequently appears on MSNBC and C-SPAN. In conversation, I am so excited to introduce Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, New York Times bestselling author of many books, including An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, Red Dirt and Blood on the Border, among many others. She's the recipient of the Cultural Freedom Prize for a Lifetime Achievement by the Lennon Foundation. So the book tonight, which I'm going to hold up and try not to disappear, is $20 and Change, Harriet Tubman and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice and Democracy, which takes up the debate over the future of the $20 bill as a lens through which to view the current state of our nation's ongoing reckoning with the legacies of slavery and foundational white supremacy. Kate Clifford Larson called it engaging and insightful and a must-read, and we could absolutely not agree more. So with that, I am going to go ahead and get out of your way. Thank you both so much for being here. Audience members, do not be shy in chat or if you need anything. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our authors. So welcome, both of you. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you. Thank you so much for that great introduction.
Yes. Well, I'm really happy to be back at Third Place Books and honored to be in conversation with Professor Clarence Lusane. And I wonder, Clarence, if you could maybe read a passage just first to set up our conversation.
So thank you, Third Place Books, and thank you, Roxanne. This is just so wonderful to be able to have you as my partner in this discussion. I'm going to read from the last chapter of the book, which is titled Good Trouble and Harriet Tubman. And it gives kind of conclusion of sort of where the book sort of starts and ends up, and we can take it from there. Harriet Tubman never saw a full day of democracy. She spent her whole life under various forms of racial authoritarianism. Tubman's life touched 2 centuries of US history and the country's struggle over freedom, democracy, and racial justice. When she was born in 1822, the United States was only 33 years old, and President Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were still alive. Before she turned 40, she witnessed the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, and her friend John Brown's 1859 rebellion at Harper's Ferry. She was 39 when the Civil War began and joined the fight to dismantle the Confederacy and end slavery, and to redefine the concept of American democracy to include her as 100% Black, 100% woman. In her late 40s and early 50s, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, and the Civil Rights Act were decided and enacted. She was friends with some of the greatest Americans to live, including Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Ida B. Wells. As she grew older, she lived through the inspiring rise and cruel fall of Reconstruction from 1867 to 1877, and the emergence of anti-Black terrorist organizations. Tubman was involved in the African-American racial justice struggle and the struggle for women's rights, including suffrage, along the way. A decade before she died, W. Du Bois penned The Souls of Black Folks, in which he wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," a phrase that was prescient. Harriet Tubman was unknown to many, but her experiences in the 19th century and beginning of the next world would certainly reflect the truth, and that truth of Du Bois. In the final years of her life, the NAACP was founded in 1909, and Ronald Reagan was born in 1911. And millions of African Americans and jazz began to spread around the nation. From 1619 to the current era, from the famous to the unknown, Black people, particularly Black women, have engaged in good trouble to advance racial equality, social justice, and racial democracy. Harriet Tubman's life was an embodiment of that spirit, and honoring her legacy to ask us to use what freedom and democracy we have not benefited ourselves to help others dismantle structures of domination and racial hierarchy that continue to make us collectively unfree. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. She just has to be the most amazing human being that ever lived. I was thinking these superhero and now many heroine movies, that none of them come close to Harriet Tubman. She's been an inspiration to me since the women's liberation movement, when I was pretty young and involved in the early time. And I was also a graduate student in history, and of course I I had heard of Harriet Tubman, but I was doing Latin American history, so I really didn't know that much. And I wonder, what do you think we have to learn from Harriet Tubman today?
So this is an excellent. This is really an excellent question, because if you went anywhere, third grade on up in American schools, somewhere you read about Harriet Tubman and you encountered her. She's globally famous, but at the same time, there's also a constricted view of her, and it tends to stop at the Civil War. So everyone knows that she escaped from slavery, daring escape, and then decided she would go back on numerous occasions to rescue family members and friends. And then when the Civil War started, she became involved in the Civil War. And so that's sort of where she gets frozen. And that's really kind of misleading, because she actually, until she passed in her 90s, was active on a wide range of issues, particularly issues having to do with women's rights and with suffrage. And I think that's important to point out, because and she also talked about the poor. She also talked about assistance for people who were infirm, which was the term she was used, people who had disabilities, like Harriet Tubman. When she was young and enslaved, at one point, she was hit in the head with some kind of solid block. And she almost died. She managed to survive, but she had disability from that the rest of her life. She would often simply have seizures or pass out in the middle of a sentence. Probably some development of epilepsy or something. But she had that her entire life. She was not given any health care to deal with that. The lives of people who were enslaved were only valuable to the degree that they could be worked, and generally worked to death. So she spoke out on all of those issues. When she was dying in 1913, in March, it was a few weeks before a very famous Women's March for suffrage, for women's voting rights, that was to take place. And as she was dying, some of her final words were, send strength to the women who were going to be part of that march, and for them to stand strong. So from birth to literally death, Harriet Tubman, in my mind, was fighting for a democracy that was multidimensional, multiracial, multigender, multi-religious, and really represented the genuine article on that issue. And that is in contrast, of course, with Andrew Jackson, who currently sits on the face of the $20 bill. As many people listening know, Jackson was the 7th president of the United States. He was someone who was enslaved people. He was a slave trader. He personally participated in massacres of indigenous people. When he became president in the 1920s, he focused on seizing land from Native people and pushed through policies, ultimately leading to the very tragic Trail of Tears that happened later in the 1830s, which hundreds and hundreds of people died. This is who's on the $20 bill. His notion of democracy did not include women, did not include people of color, did not include people without property. It was a very narrow, very restrictive view of how society should function and operate.
Yeah, that's exactly why I think you argue that and many others have as well, and I think we really have to fight for it, is to remove him completely, because they want to put him on the back of the $20 bill. That seems like such an insult to Harriet Tubman herself, that they're somehow the same or equally giants, equally important, and they aren't, and so what do you think we can do to pressure having him removed?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think people who have heard about it and sort of support it think that Harriet will be on the front and Jackson will be gone, but currently that's not the plan. And I thought about this a lot in the last day or so, because I was thinking about how we see Martin Luther King. And after a long fight, there's a federal holiday, Martin Luther King National Federal Holiday. However, when you really kind of scratch below the surface, in a number of places around the country, Mississippi, Alabama, other states, they do not celebrate King Day, they celebrate King Lee Day. And what they're celebrating is Martin Luther King and Robert E. Lee, who was the lead general for the Confederacy. And it's that kind of misinformation and confusion that dishonors people like Martin Luther King, and in this case, Harriet Tubman. There is no justification whatsoever that puts Harriet Tubman and Andrew Jackson in the same world when it comes to values, when it comes to what society really should be about. And so just as people in those states are fighting to separate Martin Luther King from Robert E. Lee, that they do not both represent the same values or they didn't have the same goals. That should be our fight around this $20 bill in Harriet Tubman. And, we've talked to the Biden administration, we've talked to the Treasury. So there may be some movement on that, but that's right now going to be a fight. And I think it will be a fight not only with whatever administration will be around. The bill is scheduled to come out around 2030, but also with Congress. And that the Republican side of Congress very much in its anti-CRT, anti-1619 approach to history, very much would not want Andrew Jackson to be removed as he should, as they continue to fight to uphold a mythology about history that's in their political interest.
Yeah, well, let me backtrack a little bit about the title. It's such a gripping title, $20 and change, Harriet Tubman and the ongoing fight for racial justice and democracy. Could you talk about the title and how in some ways those few words really summarize the book? So what's the connection between the lives of those two people and the present? How I mean, you've talked about that a little bit, but how did you come to this concept? I just kept thinking, reading the book, that it's a unique concept where you delve into history deeply and into figures, but also then just to the present, that it's all so relevant to the present. So I think the title actually gives that, promises that, and it comes through. But how'd you come up with the idea of that you know, just as an author myself, it's just a really brilliant way to talk about the present.
So the title has multiple dimensions to it. For one, it argues that we need the power of symbolism and representation, but we also need transformation. And those two are not in conflict with each other, or they don't need to be in conflict with each other, and they need to work hand in hand. More concretely, and I think this was unknown at the time, Harriet Tubman, when she worked for her work in the Civil War, where she was a spy, she was a nurse, she was a military leader, she cooked, she did multiple jobs under contract. She felt, rightly so, because men, and particularly Confederates, were getting pensions after the war. And so she petitioned for a pension for the work that she had done. As it turned out, this became a decades-long battle for her to get what was rightfully hers. She had support from members in Congress. She had support from former political leaders, but it just took a long while. So finally, though, in the 1890s, she was granted a pension, and that pension turned out to be $20 a month, right? So that's just kind of a historic kind of irony that just was there. But it also connects with the way in which African Americans and other people who are marginalized have had to struggle for what was justly due and what was really kind of owed. Another way in which the $20 bill actually sort of comes out, there's a whole chapter, is what happened around George Floyd. What initiated the situation was a allegation that George Floyd was passing a counterfeit $20 bill in the cup market. And he went in, he brought something, he paid with this $20 bill. After he left, the young clerk became suspicious, thought that it was not a real bill, and went out to where George Floyd was sitting in the car and told him that he had to come back in. George Floyd refused to do it, and they called the police. And then we saw what happened after that. Later on, the store owner, who was familiar with George Floyd, said that he did not think for a second that George Floyd was trying to pass, trying to intentionally pass a phony $20 bill. And if he had been there, they would have worked it out. He certainly would not have called the cops. But again, that just sort of pops up in this whole story of ways in which no benefit of the doubt is given to poor people, to people who are marginalized, and then it often can lead to these really, really kind of tragic events. And again, at the core of this is Harriet Tubman on the bill, the removal of Andrew Jackson. And it's no accident that Andrew Jackson was Donald Trump's favorite president and the one he sought to emulate. And that's pretty close. If there was, two of the most horrible presidents in U.S. history, certainly were Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson. So, that really sort of also becomes a part of the narrative and the ways in which, when Trump became president, he put a portrait of Andrew Jackson in a very prominent position in the Oval Office, and you will often see it in pictures where Trump is sitting at his desk. And on brand Trump would make racist remarks relative to Native Americans, as that Andrew Jackson portrait overlooked the office.
Yeah, I think he even made a point of, when he was giving talks on television, to sit in that chair underneath that picture, which is very obnoxious. Your book really brought back to me a memory of when I was younger, back in the early 70s. I worked for a year in a casino at the Harris Club in Nevada, and I was a change girl, slots change girl, with a big pocket of $20 bills. Everyone gave me a $20 bill, and I had to make change for it. And I had to keep looking. I had to keep the front up. We were trying to do this. And it really almost drove me crazy. I would be exhausted looking at Andrew Jackson, and because I was a historian, thinking about everything he had done. So it's sort of nightmarish job just because of that. Well, let's talk about the linkage also. Of course, it was Dr. King's birthday yesterday, or Sunday, and celebrated yesterday. A long arc of voting rights that is a racial justice movement. That it's such a long history, but I don't think most people take it back to the point you make about Harriet Tubman being early democracy, real democracy, not even just representative democracy, but she was, the arc really should go back to her, I think.
Yeah, this has been an issue a driving issue in Black politics before the Civil War. It was an issue in the North where African Americans were not enslaved, but in many circumstances could not vote. The laws are very racially specific, and so it continued to be a fight. There were movements in the 1830s and 1840s by Black Americans, specifically around voting. That's in part what led Frederick Douglass to align with the suffrage movement, particularly after 1848 in Seneca Falls, which is seen as a very notable point in how that movement began to grow and expand. And throughout history, Black people continue to fight on this. Every single Black leader, whether they were conservative, whether they were nationalists, whether they were socialists, whether they were communists, the vote was always somewhere in those politics because of its criticalness. And people, of course, died fighting for the right to vote. And every advance, whether it was the 15th Amendment, which technically gave voting rights to men who had been enslaved, the 19th Amendment, which gave voting rights to women. There was a law passed in 1924 that gave voting rights to Native Americans. And all of these, it really still never resolved that everyone should have an equal and fair right to vote without obstacles. And here we are in 2023, still dealing with this issue. The Guardian newspaper yesterday, I think, came out with an article that said already in 2023, not 2022, in 2023, there have already been dozens of voter restriction laws or bills that are being promoted at the state level. And we also know that in Congress, where there was an effort through the John Lewis voting rights law proposal and another voting bill, those did not succeed. and they have no chance of succeeding now that the Republicans are in charge of the House of Representatives. But we're talking 2023. This is 101 years after Harriet Tubman was born, that the fight for voting rights is just as intense as it was when she was born in 1822, as far as many people are concerned.
Yes, that's definitely the success of the backlash that to the civil rights movement that took hold in the 1970s and really has practically won now. It's just almost inconceivable how much things could be set back so quickly. But it's been long time coming. I mean, it's just people weren't, I don't know, we just weren't taking it seriously enough to really fight it earlier in time. But now it's getting, well, that brings me to the question about your thesis of the relationship between authoritarianism and racism.
Yeah, so this is my biggest concern, is that we have evolved, and as you pointed out, you can kind of date it back to the 70s with the backlash against the women's movement, the Black freedom movement, the Latino movement, the movement even by seniors. This conservative backlash that grew and grew and grew. And while at one point it was a fringe of the Republican Party, it has become the Republican Party. And a white supremacist, white nationalist agenda is what's on the table. And that goes beyond the former president. Whether he's around or not, it has metastasized, so that really is what constitutes the current and contemporary and dangerous GOP. And at every level, from Congress to state houses to local levels. And this merger of this far-right political extremism, the conservative media that animate and accelerate this movement, and these militias that and lone militias and individuals who absolutely believe that violence is justifiable to achieve their agenda, whether it's kidnappings like they wanted to do for the governor of Michigan, whether the shootings that just happened that we've seen, whether it's the ongoing threats to school board members, to election workers. This is the atmosphere that has to be beat back at this point.
Yeah, well, you do in the book, and I really recommend that people read this because it does lay out a blueprint, I think, or at least a framework for how we should be organizing. So you presented a guide for dealing with this immediate political future that we're experiencing. But just how big a threat is the contemporary GOP and Trumpism?
I would say the most dangerous threat in the world at the moment, because the access to the levers of power that could be held by these extremists is no joke at all. And we see these manifestations like what happened in Brazil. We saw it in Germany. We see it in Italy. This is not a marginalized moment. This is one in which authoritarianism really is ascending and has to be pushed back. And I think that requires for progressives and leftists strategies that are recognizing that the front in the united front that has to be built to beat back these forces is of an urgent nature. And if this does not happen, the danger is really clear if these forces get complete power.
Yes, and the Supreme Court is, of course, fully
Right.
Christian white nationalist, and it's hard to even think of very much legislation being able to go through that is not set back by them.
Right.
But
right.
In a positive way, what? Go ahead. You were going to say something else.
No, I was agreeing with you. It's absolutely daunting that there's a 6-3 far right majority on the court that at this point will be there for years, if not decades. They put people on the court who are in their who can be around. Clarence Thomas has been on the court 30 years. So if you can imagine a 6-3 right-wing majority for the next 30 years, just the horrors of all of that. There are, the movement can address that. What I try to talk about in the book is the overwhelming majority in the country not support these policies and these initiatives. And the far right has been adept at exploiting the loopholes of U.S. democracy, the Electoral College, the unfair structure of the U.S. Senate. There are a number of built-in undemocratic features that have been utilized. And so part of our battle is pushing back against those, going after those undemocratic processes and structures, and being able to mobilize the majority of the country that does not support these policies. Now, tens of millions of people do, so it's not a given that those forces are going to just be easily beaten, but they have been beaten.
Yeah. Well, on a positive note, what would a pro-democracy agenda look like today, 2023? What can we form in building up to 2024 that could be effective?
So that's an excellent question. And there hasn't been a pro-democracy agenda, at least not one that's been fully fronted. And so in part, it means, I think, both a melding of an agenda that meets people's needs, that addresses income inequality, that addresses basic income and resources, medical health, education, those concerns, with an agenda that again goes after, maybe going after is the wrong word, but seek to address the problems of the Electoral College, the problems of unfair redistricting. Part of the reason the Republicans are in charge of the House of Representatives now has to do with redistricting that they were in charge of in 2010 and 2020. And there needs to be nonpartisan redistricting. When you look at Michigan, which flipped, and the Republicans were thrown out of power, it's in part because they had a very different approach to redistricting versus what we saw in New York, for example, where it got really stupid and sloppy and messy. And ultimately, the Democrats got outmaneuvered, and those seats were lost. That should have been one that would have been very important in stopping Republicans coming to power. So there's a wide range of issues that have to be upfront and on the agenda. I think for progressives, as well as the Democratic Party, and there are battles to be had at the state level and the local levels. The red wave that the Republicans were predicting did not happen. There were major defeats everywhere, but the red wave actually did have a major impact in the South. And there were significant gains by far-right Republicans in places like Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. So we're seeing those areas that we have to pay attention to, and we have to have solidarity with people who are struggling in those states and in that region, which often gets ignored and sometimes gets ignored. But that's where a lot of the battleground is happening as well.
Yeah, and you do talk about in the book, even though you didn't know it when you were writing it, that that the Democrats no longer control the House of Representatives. So are there strategies that you've thought about to extend your thesis in the book that could be used to address these concerns like, police reform, climate change, income inequality, healthcare, like you said, national healthcare, maybe? Would any of those things, is there an agenda that could be built, say, by progressives anyway, to counteract the at least for the next 2 years, maybe longer, of
yeah, so there is quite a bit going on at the local level and at the state level. There are regional organizations, state organizations, progressive ones that are at the center of those fights, and they're making some gains. And so we really have to appreciate and magnify what's happening at those levels. Everybody from Reverend Barber and Poor People's Campaign to stuff that's being done by Move On and other progressive organizations, particularly again centering the battle over democracy and democratic rights. At the national level, I think there has to be pressure put on the Biden administration, which did not have what I would consider the kind of campaign for democracy when the Democrats had the House and the Senate. And President Biden was reluctant to do much because he thought legislation might come through. But now that it hasn't, on criminal justice reform, on voting rights, on the climate, he needs to get that pen out and begin to fulfill some of the promises that were made during the campaign. And the Republicans will not be able to pass laws to stop him because he's not going to pass in the Senate and he's not going to sign any of these laws. So that at the federal level is about all that can be done over the next 2 years. And again, given, as you point out, the Supreme Court and given the far right control of the House of Representatives.
Yeah, I think he should really turn to executive orders because even though they can be reversed if Congress goes Republican, there's still, some time
Right.
that some things could develop that are popular and people won't want them, won't allow
Right.
them to be reversed. Well, what else have you thought about since you've been on book tour? What kind of reaction do you feel? Do you feel a sense of fight in people that they're determined to, or a kind of passivity that we've, seems like has developed so much, maybe because the pandemic and so many other things, but also just the unrelenting horror of the Trump period, that it's just kind of a relaxation. Well, it's not that bad, now. But
Yeah.
do you get the sense on the road, that people are really thinking about things?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pushback. It has been very wearying. The last couple of years was just hard on the country as a whole, and then many communities suffered much worse than some other communities, and that damage is there, but people are pushing back. And people were very mobilized around last year's election, not just on candidates, but on issues around voting rights, issues around in response to the Dobbs decision, for example. So, it's my sense that there is a fight going on. We have to mobilize it better, but it is engaged. And again, in spite of just a really horrific last couple of years and, very severe losses for many people, people have not given up. And it's really the far right minority that is going to be being targeted, and has not going to have an easy way going forward.
Yeah, I think that word is very important, that we sense that they have so much power, but they are a minority, a very, pretty small minority, considering, and probably 25%, these hardcore white nationalists, that this is how authoritarianism always takes over, with a very small
Right.
and bullying and violence. And I think we have to be aware that we'll really, again, kind of thinking about Dr. King this weekend, the importance of civil disobedience and massive protests. I think that's the only thing that can really challenge. We had that moment of Black Lives Matter movement that was so inspiring to people, that we have to, they couldn't do that alone. We have to keep that going, I think. I'm just wondering what you think about that, how we can mobilize and, really give people hope too, and so they can do things in their own community.
So, a lot of what I do is international. And, I work with, communities around the world on human rights, racial justice, those kinds of issues. So Black Lives Matter was global, and everywhere from, the Fiji Islands to Australia, to the UK, to Germany, to Brazil,
Palestine.
everywhere. Because it touched the very essence of what people really see is what they're fighting for, and people want justice, and people want a reckoning with the past. And so
Right.
the movement that not only fought around policing, and police harassment and police killing, and fought around issues of unfairness relative to COVID, to the pandemic. But these issues, these movements also tore down the symbols of colonialism, racism, segregation, slavery, all of those ways in which those symbols attempted to justify and to honor those that past, and people just are not having it anymore. And so that was, that was also just kind of really important movement. And, and the book kind of takes that up as well. And again,
Yeah.
Harriet Tubman's replacing Andrew Jackson, is in that mainstream.
Yeah, I think your book is so timely because we really need to honor and be inspired by our heroes. And of course, I think John Brown is always a incredible inspiration that really, touches people, that it was that bad that he felt he had to do that.
Right.
That kind of violence against the state, and to really reveal it. And it really did crack open, it really did, was what Melville called it, the comet of to the war. But it seems like there are a lot of similarities between the pre-Civil War period and Harriet Tubman's activities and this period that we're in now. And how do you think we can fight without a civil war? I mean, a civil war would be unimaginable in the United States. The amount of violence, the guns, 400
Right.
million guns floating around in civilian hands.
Well, as you wrote about in your great book, Loaded, this whole way in which a misinterpretation of the Second Amendment and to deny its roots in native land seizures and slavery, befalls us to this very day. But I think that there has to be an aggressive push by folks who have the authority to go after these undemocratic and often violent illegal movements. And that hasn't happened. I always tell the story in 1923 in Munich. There was a meeting of government officials in Munich, Germany, in a beer hall. These beer halls were gigantic, and hundreds of people. And the very nascent Nazi party decided they were going to seize the government. They surrounded the building. They went inside. They captured some of the political leaders and tried to get them to surrender. However, they forgot about the military and the police on the outside. So they came and took the building back. Hitler escaped for a couple of days, but he was eventually captured. Usually treason is, at a minimum, life imprisonment, often capital punishment. Hitler went to prison for a year. That's when he wrote Mein Kampf. 10 years later, he was in power. So you cannot let these movements fester. You have to crush them. And I'm not saying, violently or illegally, but they cannot be allowed to flourish because they do not voluntarily go away. And if they come to power, they use that power. They are not kidding. They are not playing around. They have an agenda. They have to be crushed.
Well, I think that's a good way to end. I see that Ali is there way wanting to start the Q&A. So Thanks so
Sorry, I
much.
was passionate about that, but
So yeah, I've hated to interrupt this wonderful conversation. But we have just a few minutes more. So far, the Q&A is quiet. I'm seeing some shyness in the audience, but I'm going to just give a little bit of space. So if anyone thinks of a question in the next couple of minutes, please write and let us know. We would love to hear about it. In the meantime, I would love to ask, so I know because I was eavesdropping in the green room that you wrote this in 2020 during COVID quarantine. And now it is out in the world. And I'm wondering what you hope people take away from this book after reading it. Is there like, what if you could choose one thing, what would that kind of be?
So I hope that people see the urgency of defending democracy and pushing back against the authoritarianism that's out there. And Harriet Tubman would be one of the inspirations for committing to doing that.
Absolutely. Love it. So, all right, I'm going to ask one more question. Folks, if you have questions, now is the time. So while you were writing this book, is there a moment that sort of sticks out to you as being the best writing moment, and was there a moment that was the hardest for you?
Okay, so I think the best is it gave me an opportunity to talk about my grandmother. In the chapter on voting rights, I talk about how my grandmother was active on the issue in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Alabama. She lived in Bessemer, which is right next to Birmingham, and she was involved with all of that, worked with Martin Luther King, worked with the very young Jesse Jackson, worked with John Lewis, and was just an inspiration in our family. And, I was, a kid at the time, so I didn't kind of get it, but she made us get it. And she lived to be 101. She led a, very, very complete life. And so I got a chance to write about her and her engagement. Again, talk about that there are people we know very well, but then, there are many unsung warriors and people who do the right thing and who see the importance of, making a commitment to be involved.
I love that. And was there like a most difficult day or chapter?
Well, it's always deadlines, so
Totally.
you don't want to answer your text or your phone because you're pressed on the deadlines. But it was really the space that COVID gave to just be home and not just really not having a lot else to do. And a lot of the pressure I had at work at the time, I was chair of the political science department, which could be demanding. The demands, went way, way, way down. So it opened up some space. So that's what happened.
Totally. So I have a question here from Andrea that says, William Barber recently accepted a position at the Yale Divinity School. I'm wondering if you can comment.
Yeah, so these Trump officials, many of whom now are trying to clean up their record with Trump, are going to get these kind of positions. They're coming out of the White House. They were in powerful positions, but they need to be reminded that they were complicit in Trump's corruption and abuse of power and all of the horrible things that he did. And it is insufficient to now come out and say, yeah, he was really a bad person, and I was in there trying to, stop it all. So whatever classes he may be teaching, where he may be headed, he needs to be reminded of that, because it's critical that people who are in these positions, if you can be worse than the people who buy into it by your silence. And so, William, and Barr plays such a, pivotal role in helping Trump at critical moments.
Yeah, here. So we have made it to time. So I think we're going to close our evening out together. I just want to take this last couple of moments to say a huge thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. For everyone who'd like to get their hands on copies of $20 and Change, I'm going to go ahead and relink it in chat so it's easy to find. I definitely recommend picking up a copy of this book, flipping through it, giving it a read, because it really is incredible work. As always, folks, let us know what you thought of this event, either in person or on any of our social media. We always love to hear from you. Clarence and Roxanne, huge thank you for being here. This has been such a wonderful evening. It was very hard to make it stop. Is there anything that you want to say before we say goodnight?
No, just again, and it's just such an honor for me to have this engagement with Roxanne. Thank you so much, Roxanne.
It was wonderful. I forgot we were even being watched,
Oh, yeah.
Conversation. So, and thanks to all the participants for listening so closely, but not talking. But I think everyone learned a lot, like I did when I read the book. But do read the book.
Mm-hmm. All right, absolutely. And with that, I think it's time. Shall we do the awkward waving goodnight thing? Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you again.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.